I sometimes think that the most revealing moments in public life are not found in press conferences or legislative chambers, but in those unguarded pockets of time when powerful people forget, even briefly, that the world is watching them. You may have seen the footage from the FIFA World Cup draw in Washington. A spectacle of lights, music, diplomatic seating charts, and the familiar swirl of cameras chasing reactions more eagerly than outcomes. What most viewers saw was a curious pairing of two men who seldom occupy the same frame. But what they may not have realized is that the real story did not lie in the performances on stage so much as in the small space between Donald Trump and Mark Carney, a space that turned out to contain far more political meaning than anyone first assumed. It is one thing to watch two public figures sit beside each other. It is quite another to understand how the choreography of human expression becomes a window into institutional behavior, personality, and the subtle work of statecraft. What officially happened was simple enough. The former president and the former central banker both attended the ceremony, sitting close enough for cameras to catch their exchanges, but far enough that no audio could betray what was being said. At first glance, it looked like pleasant, forgettable small talk, the kind of interaction that fills the margins of global events but rarely earns its own headline. Yet the headline emerged anyway when a professional lip reader analyzed the footage and claimed to decipher the content of those quiet exchanges. Suddenly, what appeared to be an ordinary moment took on new layers of meaning, not because of scandal or hostility, but because of something far more interesting. The reading suggested that Trump, a figure known for dominating rooms and roughing the edges of diplomatic conversation, was not lecturing or posturing. He was attempting to charm Carney. He was leaning toward him, not to pressure him, but to draw him in. To understand why that matters, you have to appreciate the unusual profile of Mark Carney in public life. Here is a man whose career has been shaped not by electoral politics, but by the institutional culture of central banking, a world where restraint is a professional virtue and credibility is measured not by applause, but by stability. Yet over the past decade, Carney has acquired a kind of soft political capital that travels beyond monetary policy. He has become a figure whose presence carries steadiness, equality, and shortage across most democracies today. And when someone like Trump encounters someone like Carney, the dynamic becomes a study in contrasts. One embodies volatility as a political instrument, the other embodies poise as an institutional principle. You might think this would create tension, but tension is not what the cameras captured. Instead, what viewers witnessed was something closer to gravitational pull. The lip reading suggested Trump expressing simple enjoyment during a musical performance, leaning toward Carney as if wanting to share the moment. For most politicians, that would be unremarkable. For Trump, it is notable precisely because it defies his usual instinct to occupy the center of whatever room he is in when he seeks recognition from someone else, even momentarily. It tells us something about where he perceives influence, and that perception matters in diplomacy, where influence is often exercised not through confrontation, but through calm, persistent composure. In that sense, the moment between Trump and Carney became a microcosm of a larger story, one about how leadership styles interact and how confidence can express itself without theatrics. Behind this public interaction, however, was an even more intriguing fact. Earlier that same day, Trump and Carney held a private meeting that lasted nearly an hour. No advisors, no aides, just two seasoned figures navigating whatever issues lay on the docket. In diplomatic terms, 50 minutes is not a courtesy call. It is a working session. It is the kind of meeting in which tone, pacing, and posture matter at least as much as whatever policy topics are discussed. We do not know what transpired behind that closed door, and responsible commentary requires acknowledging that. But we can observe the aftermath. Carney emerged composed, relaxed, and later appeared publicly without the slightest indication of being unsettled. Trump, by contrast, seemed unusually eager to engage with him once they shared a stage. That asymmetry gives analysts like you and me something to think about. What fascinates me most about this is not the novelty of a lip reader interpreting a fragment of political theater, but what the moment reveals about power that is exercised quietly rather than loudly. You and I live in a political era that constantly rewards volume. Yet volume is not the same as authority. When we watch these interactions closely, we begin to see the deeper mechanics of influence. The way confidence reshapes a room even when nothing explicit is said. Carney did not need to gesticulate or assert dominance. He simply remained attentive, steady, and unintimidated. In diplomacy, as in life, steadiness has a way of unsettling those who rely on force of personality. It shifts the balance subtly, but unmistakably. When Trump leaned toward him, seeking a response, he was not merely making conversation. He was recognizing, perhaps unconsciously, that he was in the presence of someone whose equilibrium could not be disrupted. This dynamic becomes even more interesting when we recall the broader context in which this encounter occurred. Trade tensions were simmering, with public statements about tariffs and manufacturing pressures swirling around North American relationships. At times like these, public ceremonies are never just ceremonies. They are stages upon which political stories continue. Even when the script appears non-political, Trump was carrying the weight of a negotiating posture that used economic pressure as leverage. Carney represented a country and a sector feeling the effects of that strategy. Yet none of that tension was visible in the body language that evening. Carney did not appear differential, nor did he appear rattled. His calmness became its own message, a form of resistance without rhetoric. That is the kind of subtle statecraft you often miss if you only read headlines. And here is where the institutional story emerges. Central bankers, for all the caricatures of them as technocrats, understand that their influence depends not on personal theatrics, but on the credibility of the institutions they represent. Confidence once earned becomes a kind of political currency. When Carney sat beside Trump, he was not merely present as an individual. He carried with him the reputation of a system built on prudence, predictability, and restraint. Trump, on the other hand, carried the identity of a political movement animated by disruption and improvisation. When those two identities meet, watchers should not be surprised that the man representing the steadier institution becomes the gravitational center of the moment. Because institutions outlast personalities, and over time, they teach us how leaders behave within them. You might be wondering why a fleeting exchange at a sporting event merits this level of scrutiny. I would suggest that it matters precisely because it shows how the habits of leadership express themselves in unscripted seconds. These habits reveal how decision-makers approach conflict, how they perceive their counterparts, and how they navigate uncertainty. A leader who tries to charm rather than overwhelm is signaling something about his expectations. A leader who receives that charm without shrinking is signaling something about his resilience. These microsignals accumulate in diplomacy. They shape how negotiations unfold, how trust is built or withheld, how concessions are offered or declined. Even the viewer at home, perhaps catching only a passing clip, is influenced by these signals. You may not consciously decode them, but you respond to them because they speak to your intuition about who appears in command of themselves and who appears animated by the moment. There is also a cultural dimension at play. In recent years, we have grown accustomed to international events being framed as arenas of conflict, as if every handshake or sideways glance carries the weight of nations. But sometimes, the deeper truth lies not in conflict, but in contrast. Trump represents a tradition of political performance animated by energy, spectacle, and dominance. Carney represents a tradition grounded in temperance, caution, and institutional confidence. These traditions collided on that stage, but not violently. They collided the way two distinct philosophies collide, each revealing its character simply by existing alongside the other. And what viewers saw, even if they did not realize it at the time, was that Carney's philosophy held its ground without theatrics. As we look more closely at the mechanics behind this moment, it becomes clear that the choreography of diplomacy is rarely as spontaneous as it appears. Leaders learn over years, sometimes decades, how to interpret and project subtle cues. They learn when to lean in, when to hold back, when to assert themselves, and when to allow someone else to take the conversational lead. These skills are not ornamental. They form the backbone of how institutions maintain continuity across changing political climates. Carney's approach demonstrates the value of that discipline. He has spent much of his career inside systems where predictability is both an expectation and a safeguard. And that habit of predictability does not vanish simply because the setting changes from a boardroom to a sports arena. When confronted with someone whose style thrives on unpredictability, Carney's steadiness becomes a stabilizing force rather than a vulnerability. Consider also the incentives operating beneath the surface. Trump often seeks to dominate interpersonal dynamics because it allows him to frame negotiations on his terms. If he can disorient or unsettle the person across from him, he increases his leverage. But this strategy falters when it meets someone who cannot easily be rattled. A steady counterpart deprives the strategy of its fuel. That appears to be what happened in Washington. Trump's charm, as interpreted by the lip-reader, functioned almost as an improvisation meant to re-establish control in a softer way. When force cannot work, familiarity sometimes can. But even then, Carney's composure did not bend. He met the moment with the same unflustered presence that has become part of his public identity. You may find it interesting that when institutional actors carry themselves with consistency, they often end up setting the pace of interaction, even when others believe they are leading it. All of this becomes even more consequential when we place it within the broader geopolitical environment. The United States, Canada, and Mexico were navigating shifting trade expectations, and every small gesture between their leaders had implications for public perception. In tense periods, even a warm moment can become a strategic symbol. Trump may have intended to display confidence, resilience, or camaraderie, but the effect on the viewer depended on who appeared more grounded. And in this instance, Carney's controlled ease created an impression that endured. When viewers perceive someone as unshaken, they often infer that the person possesses deeper insight or preparation, whether or not they know the details. That perception becomes part of the political story, shaping how future meetings are understood long before they occur. It is helpful here to think about how institutions behave when navigating uncertainty. Central banks, regulatory bodies, and international organizations all cultivate cultures of deliberation, because deliberation prevents panic and preserves legitimacy. When individuals who embody that culture step into the political spotlight, they bring that deliberation with them. Voters may not consciously articulate it, but they recognize the difference between someone speaking from institutional discipline and someone speaking from momentary impulse. The former tends to reassure, the latter tends to unsettle. And in moments of geopolitical tension, reassurance carries significant value. It is no coincidence that clips of Carney at such events tend to circulate widely, often with commentary noting his calm or his presence. People gravitate towards signals of stability, especially when political life feels unpredictable. Yet, the human dimension of this cannot be overlooked. People often imagine that diplomacy unfolds entirely in formal meetings, but so much of it happens in the unrecorded minutes before and after events. These are the moments in which personal judgments are formed, where impressions shape future interactions more than any official communique. When Trump sought Carney's reaction during a musical performance, he was engaging not in policy, but in rapport building. Rapport is a soft instrument, but a powerful one. Leaders rely on it to test boundaries, study personalities, and gauge how much room they have to maneuver. Carney's responses in those moments, even if modest, signaled that he would not be drawn into a performative dynamic. That kind of signal can set the tone for future conversations, especially in private meetings where the stakes quietly accumulate. What becomes striking as we move deeper into this story is how responsibility distributes itself among the actors involved. Trump is a figure long accustomed to shaping environments around his personality, using unpredictability as a strategic asset and performance as a political tool. His supporters admire that energy. His critics often see it as destabilizing. Yet whichever interpretation you lean toward, the method is consistent. When he leans in, he signals dominance. When he seeks a reaction, he expects engagement. When he performs enthusiasm, it is usually designed to reinforce his own centrality in the room. But what happens when the person beside him does not reinforce that centrality? What happens when the counterpart appears unimpressed, unshaken, and uninterested in reenacting the hierarchy Trump often assumes? That is where this narrative takes on its institutional texture. Carney's demeanor did not challenge Trump directly, nor did it yield. It simply existed with its own integrity. And integrity can be a quiet form of authority. This calmness is not accidental. Carney's career has been shaped by systems in which precision matters, where verbal restraint prevents market panic, and where credibility is earned through years of disciplined communication. Such environments train leaders to resist emotional volatility. That training becomes especially visible when placed next to someone whose leadership style is shaped by drama and spontaneity. The contrast reveals strengths and weaknesses on both sides. Trump's charisma can galvanize large audiences, yet it can falter in one-on-one environments where improvisation encounters steadiness. Carney's reserve may appear subdued in mass political settings, yet it becomes powerful in intimate diplomatic circles where subtle cues carry disproportionate weight. You may see moments like this and wonder how much of diplomacy is actually technique rather than ideology. I suspect it is far more than most people assume. Still, it would be a mistake to reduce this to a personality comparison alone. There are institutional consequences hidden within the exchange. For example, when a leader like Trump reveals eagerness to connect with someone representing another nation or another system, it can signal either genuine rapport or strategic positioning. That distinction matters for policymakers, for investors, and even for citizens who rely on predictable behavior from their governments. The fact that Trump appeared almost amiable toward Carney during a period of trade friction suggests that he understood the value of maintaining certain relationships, even when press statements conveyed confrontation. Leaders often behave differently behind the scenes than in front of microphones, and those differences influence negotiation outcomes. If you are someone who cares about how public postures diverge from private calculations, this moment is a case study in that divergence. And what of Carney's responsibility? His role was not to entertain Trump or to contradict him, but to represent a country and an institutional tradition built on prudence. Representation in diplomacy is not symbolic. It is functional. When Carney maintains composure in the presence of unpredictable power, he communicates reliability, which in turn communicates bargaining strength. People sometimes mistake calmness for passivity, but in institutional life, calmness is often a deliberate stance meant to preserve strategic options. A leader who shows agitation concedes leverage. A leader who remains centered retains it. Carney's behavior, whatever you may think of his broader political or economic views, demonstrated an understanding of this simple truth. Influence requires self-command. That is as old as Aristotle and as relevant today as ever. What makes this even more revealing is the timing. Just hours before the public ceremony, the two men spent nearly an hour behind closed doors. 50 minutes is enough time to outline disagreements, test each other's boundaries, and take each other's measure. When two experienced figures walk out of a meeting like that, their public appearance becomes a kind of reflection of how the private exchange unfolded. Carney's relaxed demeanor suggests he neither felt threatened nor overwhelmed. Trump's eagerness to continue engaging hints that he found the interaction notable, perhaps even unexpectedly pleasant or stimulating. In diplomacy, unexpected chemistry between two very different personalities can alter the tone of future negotiations. It does not resolve disputes, but it reframes them. And reframing is often where progress begins. You may be wondering what this means for the viewer at home, trying to interpret these events within the larger story of democratic institutions and political behavior. It means that even the smallest public gestures can illuminate how leaders understand their roles. It means that diplomacy is not only a matter of treaties and tariffs, but of temperament. It means that the health of institutions often depends on individuals who can withstand pressure without mirroring it. If you ever find yourself discouraged by the volatility of modern politics, moments like this offer a reminder that not all leadership is reactive. Some of it is controlled, intentional, and quietly influential. As I reflect on all of this, I am reminded that political life often turns on moments most people dismiss as incidental. A brief exchange on a stage, a few unguarded gestures, a quiet lean toward a counterpart can reveal more about the state of leadership than an entire week of formal statements. What we witnessed between Trump and Carney was not a clash of ideologies, but a meeting of temperaments, each shaped by the different institutions that produced them. Trump approached the moment with theatrical instinct, reaching for connection as a way to shape the atmosphere around him. Carney approached it with a discipline familiar to anyone who has spent years safeguarding public trust from the volatility of markets and politics. The result was not confrontation, but contrast. And in that contrast, we could see how influence sometimes rests not in volume, but in quiet steadiness. For you, the viewer, the lesson is not about choosing sides in a dispute, but about understanding the forces that define leadership in democratic life. Institutions need individuals who can remain composed when others escalate. They need people who bring clarity where others bring noise. They need figures who can navigate unpredictable personalities without losing their own center of gravity. Carney demonstrated that quality in Washington, and Trump's response to it, whether intentional or not, revealed how powerful that quality can be. It showed that even in moments filled with spectacle, the most enduring influence belongs to those who project confidence without demanding it. As we close this topic, I leave you with a simple thought. In an era saturated with loudness, watch closely for the people who do not need it. They are often the ones shaping events long after the cameras turn away. And if you find value in conversations that slow down the noise and help you make sense of how politics, institutions, and personality intersect in moments like this, I invite you to stay engaged, share your perspective, and keep exploring these deeper currents with Hay.